Today we are exploring, going deep into the back shelves of the library, wiping the dust off, turning the pages, unveiling two forgotten English language novels set in Taiwan. The first is called A Maid From Heaven, published in 1966, and the second, Band of Brothers, 1973. So my co-host John Ross has a literary Indiana Jones, unearthed these buried treasures. But John, these two novels are not from your Taiwan in 100 books book that tells the history of Taiwan through, well, as the title suggests, 100 plus books, are they?
No, these two novels were not in my Taiwan in 100 books book, but I learned about them from a reader of that book. An old-time friend of Taiwan and a bibliophile, Harold Ottness, wrote to me with some suggestions for reading.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
Cool. Well, thank you, Harold Ottness. Which novel should we look at first?
Let's do it in chronological order.
Okay, so that would be A Maid From Heaven by Australian Kenneth Grenville, published by MacMillian in 1966. And maid, well, we're not talking about an excellent house cleaner, but a maiden, a lovely young woman. A common theme in Chinese mythology is a heavenly maiden descending to the mortal realm and falling in love with a human. Doesn't always end very well.
Okay, this novel opens with an audio portrait of Taipei as dusk falls.
Okay, reading from the book, quote, "In the evening at about 10 o'clock, a massive plug seems to be drawn out beneath Taipei, and her gray reservoir of noises drains away. Gone are the rumble of trains, the hoots of packed buses, in a perpetual game of chicken. Few pedicab drivers remain to joust with insolent bells and trade insults in high Taiwanese. Small, intimate sounds may emerge now among the gray buildings of Taipei." End quote.
The narrator mentions the calls of food vendors selling sweet potatoes, dumplings, barbecued ducks, and from the protagonist's second-floor room window in the Great Wall Hotel, a fictional name, I think, our protagonist and narrator hears and sees a beautiful young woman playing a Chinese flute.
The start of a love story.
Yes, a love story of sorts. So the narrator and protagonist of the story is a middle-aged and married Australian accountant who is in Taipei for a conference. He befriends, this flute player, a young blind masseuse, and it's the start of a doomed affair. It's an interesting period piece, an odd book full of overwrought musings, and with an immensely sudden and sad ending.
A blind flute-playing masseuse. Whoa. You said overwrought musings? What do you mean by that?
Oh, just it's a bit sappy, like when you're in love and spouting nonsense, and a lot of sort of exotic, the shiny black hair and the silky skin, sort of contains the mysteries of the Orient and
the porcelain white of her skin. Okay, so some of that pretty intense stuff.
Yeah, the novel has an intensity of feeling and detail that screams autobiographical.
And you said the main character was an Australian man, middle-aged and married, as was the author.
Yeah,
an Australian man, middle-aged and married.
Yes.
So according to the book blurb, the story was, quote, the product of his visits to Taiwan.
Yeah. Okay, there's a difference. He was a lawyer, the writer, not an accountant. So yeah, there's a difference. The author, Kenneth Grenville G., born 1915, passed away 2008. He was an Australian prosecutor, a judge, and in his early adulthood, he became an active Marxist of the Trotskyite persuasion. He hated Stalin. But later, he became a staunch supporter of anti-communism, the anti-communist South Vietnam government, and also the nationalists on Taiwan.
Interesting.
Yeah, although Australia never had a China lobby, Australia didn't have the United States' long, close relationship with China, its missionary work, trade, and wartime cooperation. There were still some, KMT friends in Australia, such as G, who championed Taiwan and were welcome visitors to the island.
So, John, you were telling me before we started recording that you actually tried to reissue this book, but it fell through.
Yes, I wanted to reissue it, not because I love the book. It's very odd in multiple ways, and it was quite dated, but it is an interesting period piece, a quirky, memorable read.
I assume there's a lot of satisfaction in taking out-of-print books from the shadows and, giving them a second life.
Yeah, so I did a bit of research on the book, soon discovered that the name on the cover, Kenneth Grenville, was actually Kenneth Grenville G., and that his daughter is Kate Grenville, one of Australia's most successful authors. And I read her memoir of her mother, and the daughter, she mentions helping her father with the novel. When she was just 15 years old, she helped him read the final proofs. This is before it's printed. She helped him proofread the final copy.
Okay, wait a second. So you're getting your teenage daughter, 15 years old, to proofread your novel about your affair with a blind masseuse flute-playing Chinese woman. A little odd.
Yes, and according to a Sydney Morning Herald article, Kate learnt, probably later, I guess, that the novel was, quote, based on a lover he had in China, end quote.
The China, okay, I think probably that's just lazy reporting. They meant Taiwan Republic of China.
Yes. Anyway, I contacted the family via an agent asking to reissue the novel, but the family declined.
So you got a Dear John letter?
Yes, a simple, we do not wish to reissue the book.
But why not?
No reason was given, but I guess they thought that the subject matter was a little embarrassing and the content and tone too stuck in its time.
That's disappointing.
Yeah, but in the world of publishing, a sorry, not interested letter is actually better than most attempts. The big publishers usually ignore such requests regarding out-of-print books.
So that author, Ken G., not Kenny G, just to be clear, the long-haired saxophone, was a strong supporter of the nationalists. In general, John, how were ROC Australia relations at this time?
Pretty good. The Australian government officially switched recognition from Taipei, the ROC, to Beijing, the PRC, in December 1972.
Well, that would be in line with what was happening internationally, right? There was Nixon's visit to China earlier in the year, and China replacing the ROC at the United Nations in 1971. So did the Aussies have an embassy here?
Not early on. The relationship wasn't especially close, but in 1966, the year A Maid From Heaven was published, the new Australian Prime Minister, Harold Holt, he decided to establish an embassy, and he sent a proper ambassador.
This is kind of against the trend at the time. This was a case of, I'm thinking, anti-communist sentiment. Australia having troops in the Vietnam War, Australia's close ties with the US.
That's right, yes. And this Harold Holt, the new Aussie Prime Minister, he visited Taiwan in April 1967, the first Australian PM to do so. In fact, I think he was the first Commonwealth leader to visit Taiwan.
In case anybody doesn't know, the Commonwealth is a loose confederation of former countries of the British Empire, including your native New Zealand, Canada, and currently Australia, but we'll have to see how long that lasts.
Yes. Yeah, so quite a landmark visit, and Harold Holt, got a great reception. Arriving at Songshan Airport in the city, he was given full military honors and a 19-gun salute. It was a 3-day visit. He met with top leaders, visited the newly opened National Palace Museum, dined with Chiang Kai-shek. But 6 months later, the Australian PM, who was a keen swimmer, went swimming in the ocean. This is in Australia, and he disappeared. His body was never found.
Yeah, Did not know that he had ever visited Taiwan, but I did know that he went swimming and disappeared. That's Holt's famous disappearing act, mysterious death. And John, you're continuing your, I would say, habit of bringing us darkness at the end of a story.
Okay. I mention the death simply because, although it was obviously just a simple case of drowning, because they never found the body.
Okay, let me guess. Wild, crazy conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and even a bizarre book claiming that Holt had been an agent, first for the ROC, a spy for the nationalist Chinese, and then later, tricked by the commies, he became a PRC spy. And his disappearance was staged. He'd been picked up by a Chinese submarine and gone to live in Beijing.
This sounds like complete nonsense.
Yeah, complete nonsense.
What probably happened was he went for a swim and drowned and then got eaten by a shark.
A shark with an Australian accent. Okay.
Definitely. Okay, let's turn to the second of those two forgotten books. The second one was Band of Brothers.
Band of Brothers was published in 1973, and it's set in Taiwan a decade earlier, 1963. It's a forgotten book today, but, back at the time, it was quite a big deal. It's by a best-selling American aviation writer called Ernest K. Gann.
Band of Brothers. Never heard of the novel or the author. But doing a Google search here, I see he and his book were big enough 50 years ago to warrant a full-page advert in Flying Magazine, which was an aviation magazine.
Yeah, I see the hardback was selling for $8 at the time. It's about $50 in today's money. Books have become relatively cheaper over time, Publishing today, it's a hard business. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Don't lose the plot, John.
Okay, the plot, thank you. So in Band of Brothers, an old-timer, a flying legend called Alexander Malloy, is blamed for the fatal crash of a 727 he's piloting for a fictitious Taiwan airline. He crashes on the approach to the Taipei airport on a flight from Manila.
And the international airport in those days was the old one, Zhongshan in the city, not the new one in Taoyuan.
Right. So the foreign pilot is held responsible for the death of 14 passengers and one crewman and is charged by ROC authorities with criminal negligence. So the hero of our story, a fellow pilot and old friend, can't accept this. He assembles a team, hence Band of Brothers, a team of pilots from around the world, and they head to Taipei to try to prove Malloy's innocence.
Okay, this is quite the plot. Flying can definitely be exciting. You got dogfights, but an airplane crash investigation, it's a bit technical. I don't imagine it makes for really good reading.
You're right. It's not especially good reading. As you surmised, there are technical details about navigation and communication systems, faulty equipment, procedures, and such. It's an okay read if you're really into aviation, but if you're just looking for the Taiwan angle, it's a waste of time, really. The novel is as much a series of flashbacks to flying adventures around the world, courtesy of this multinational Band of Brothers, and it doesn't have that much Taiwan flavor.
Do you know if the unfortunately surnamed person Gan came to Taiwan?
Not for sure, but you'd not guess it from the novel. But it does have some Taiwan flavor in an unmentioned factual inspiration for his story.
So Band of Brothers was based on a real crash?
Yeah, loosely. A 1968 crash of Civil Air Transport, Flight 10. Returning from Hong Kong, it's a Boeing 727, crashed on its approach to Taipei Airport February 16th, 1968, crashed near Linkou. 21 of the 63 people on board died. One person on the ground was killed. The cause of the crash was declared to be pilot error, and the two pilots were charged with manslaughter through negligence.
That's interesting. Those who think that name, Civil Air Transport, sounds familiar, it was an airline founded by Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers fame. It was owned by the Nationalist, the airline, later owned by the Americans. in fact owned by a certain government agency known as the CIA.
Hmm.
So as well as the front for some regular civilian flights, CAT undertook covert operations, such as dropping supplies to Tibetan freedom fighters. Also, KMT holdouts in Burma's Golden Triangle, and I think rebels in Indonesia as well.
And this plane, the 727, was the only civil air transport aircraft that flew international routes. And the crash resulted in international flights being taken over by the national carrier China Airlines.
Okay, I'm not superstitious, but did you note the date of that crash? February 16th, which happens to be my sister's birthday as well.
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, not really, as I didn't notice anything special. I'm not saying your sister's birthday is not on February 16th.
Yeah, and I don't think she has anything to do with either of the crashes. But
Okay.
exactly 30 years after this accident, a China Airlines flight from Bali, Indonesia to Taipei crashed, killing about 200 people. We did an episode about that and a spate of other accidents.
Yeah. Eryk, if I were looking for a real life incident upon which to base a Taiwan aviation story, I would rewind the time dial back a little to 1964 and the mysterious crash of another civil aviation transport plane. This is the CAT Flight 106, all 57 crew and passengers on board killed, and an accident officially said to be caused by engine failure compounded by pilot error.
Okay, this is more interesting. And who was on the plane?
There were 20 Americans, 1 Briton, and members of the Malaysian delegation to the 11th Film Festival in Asia, most notably businessman Lok Wun To and his wife Mavis. Lok was one of the richest men in Asia. His empire included rubber plantations, banks, cinemas, and a movie studio called Cathay.
Okay, so this rich guy, Lok, was in Taiwan for the film festival.
Yeah, the film festival was in Taipei. It had wrapped up. The best film chosen was a color Taiwanese picture called Oyster Girl. Some of the film people went on a sightseeing flight in central Taiwan. Have you heard of the Shaw Brothers Studios?
Yeah, huge Hong Kong film studio. Lots of kung fu movies,
Yeah, and overseas Chinese cinema in those days was dominated by 2 families, the Shaw family, headed by Run Shaw, and the Lok family, headed by this, it's very hard saying these Hokkien names, isn't it? Okay, this Lok Wan To. Both men were in Taiwan for the film festival, each invited on a sightseeing tour. Mr. Shaw declined, but Lok agreed to go.
So when the plane crashed, taking him, his wife, several actresses, 4 executives, it changed Chinese cinema. The whole Cathay company died along with its boss. What was the flight number again?
Civil Air Transport Flight 106. And the airplane was a C-46.
C-46, that's a World War II plane, twin propeller engine. The Pacific China Theater in World War II, it was used during that. There's one in the Gangshan Aviation Exhibition Hall here in Kaohsiung. We talked about that a while back.
Yeah. But in this crash, the particular aircraft was 20 years old. Maybe even one of the planes Ernest Gann flew when he was flying supplies over the hump, the eastern Himalayas. They were flying supplies to the nationalist Chinese troops in southwest China.
Okay, I've pulled up the Wikipedia page. It says, quote, "The accident. Shortly after takeoff from Taichung, the number 1 engine oversped. The pilot began a left turn to perform an emergency landing, but while turning, the pilot lost control and the aircraft crashed. The Taiwanese Civil Aeronautics Administration concluded that the primary cause of the accident was the failure of the number 1 engine, compounded by pilot error. However, this conclusion was disputed by Civil Air Transport, who seems to favor instead a theory of hijacking by a passenger." Whoa, that's cool. I mean, not, cool for, but I mean, hijacking? A failed hijacking attempt? How'd they come up with that idea?
Well, among the wreckage were 2 pistols and 2 large radar manuals, which had been hollowed out, presumably to hide the pistols. Okay, so no survivors, and some of the evidence is damaged, burnt in the fire. But yeah, there was, of course, investigations by the Taiwanese, and the CIA also took part in it. Some of the CIA documents were released decades later. A medical report on the dead bodies written by the cat's company doctor.
Oh, so the report or documents from the CIA, do they mention those two guns found at the crash scene, hidden perhaps in that radar instruction book thing?
No, things I've seen didn't cover that. They did mention them, though. They did reference them, that they'd been covered in another report, and also that they were worth further investigation.
Yeah, and what do they have to say about the suspected hijackers?
The report mentions two names, and there's a lieutenant. According to the report, the only man who had no single piece of paper in his clothing for identification.
Okay. How does one get on a plane without ID?
Difficult, I think.
And anything suspicious about those two radar manuals?
The radar manuals had been checked out from a library in Penghu by the lieutenant guy, Navy lieutenant in the ROC Navy. And the other chap, suspected chap, a retired Navy officer, he had wounds which were different from the other fatalities. This and some other factors led to the conclusion that he was standing at the time of the crash and standing near the pilots.
Standing near the pilots is rather suggestive of a hijacking.
Yeah, and as for where pilots shot, I don't think there was evidence one way or another. So it's a mystery, remains a mystery.
Yeah, and I'd like to wonder about the motive. Maybe they were just looking for money? Rich family?
Yes, one of the richest men in Asia.
This could be made into a movie.
Yes, we're open to offers, aren't we?
Yes. However, I know, John, that movies are not your primary love. Neither me. We love books. And before we go, we want to tell people that Plum Rain Press is becoming reality, is it not?
Yes. In about a month, we'll have our first book out.
Exciting stuff. Okay. Thanks for listening, and please do all the social media push button thingies. I'm Eric Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross. Bye.